What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more punk rock, and we are here to begin going through Propagandhi's brand new album, At Peace 2025, on Brett Gurowitz's Epitaph label. I don't need to give the whole spiel, but people who've been following this channel since the early days will know Propagandhi remains one of my favorite bands of all time, the most influential band in my personal history. I've told the story a number of times, so I'll be brief, but when I was 13/14, I think I was still 13 because I think it was the summer of '94, I went up to a hockey camp at the University of British Columbia. A kid from Montreal who was a goalie who didn't speak any English but was into punk rock, he brought a cassette tape of How to Clean Everything. We listened to it in the locker room before ice time, and I became transfixed by it. The guitar riffs, the ideas, the intensity, the power of the anarcho-punk just blew me away. So when I came back to California, it took me a little while to find it, maybe 6 months, 8 months or so, but eventually I found it on CD, and the album literally changed my life. I've been a massive fan of the band ever since, and I've enjoyed seeing and hearing the evolution of their sound over the course of the albums. Obviously, there was a big transition point when John left and Todd came in by the time you get to Today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes. Incidentally, I just did a live concert DVD watch-along from their Live from Occupied Territory performance. It's a 2003 DVD from a show they did at a venue called The Zoo in Winnipeg. So it's all part of my past, my middle past, right up into the present. And I'd just like to give a big shout out to Propagandhi for their ideas, their ethos, their persistence, their longevity. Again, I think this is their 8th album now, so they've been around 30 plus years. It's crazy to think about, but yes, ultimately I believe they are one of the most profound and inspiring bands I'm familiar with, and a lot of their booklets, they include reading lists, and a number of authors on those reading lists I eventually got books from and learned more from those experiences, so they've been part of my life more than just music per se. So big shout out to Propagandhi. I will say I'm planning to get a CD copy of this too. When it was first announced for pre-order, I didn't see any CD copies available, so I got a vinyl. But I would like to get a CD because I have all their other albums on CD, so just to be a completist with my collection of Propagandhi, and also to put the cover of the CD booklet up on my music wall here, which will obviously have to be out of frame because all the real estate here is taken, even more that you can't see, but eventually we'll get that on the music wall too. And I'd like to give a big shout out to all the folks who've been following my punk rock reactions since the very earliest days of not just this channel, but my previous channel when I began doing reactions, which again, for those who don't know the story, I had an old YouTube channel, ran it for like 10 years. I just put up DJ mixes. And then in the beginning of 2022, I started doing reactions, and a couple months later, for very arcane reasons, YouTube made it so that I had to start a new channel. And some of the people who've been following my punk rock reactions go back to that period. Big shout out to you, Ryan, a punk rocker from up in Winnipeg, the home turf, more or less, of Propagandhi, but also Jimmy and Lloydie, as well as Michaela and Kim, who've been commenting on Propagandhi reactions going back a while now, so you are all greatly appreciated. I'm very excited to go through this album with you, and I should point out, when I opened this earlier, I noticed that on the inner sleeve, which unfortunately in my case has like a small tear in it already, but such is life. Nothing remains pristine forever, as Carl Sagan would say. In any case, there are lyrics on the inner sleeve, so I'm going to listen, I'm going to think about what I caught from the lines, and then after that I'll be able to read the lyrics properly, maybe with the help of my phone. The print's not terribly small, but again, I'm in my mid-40s and my eyes get a little more strained trying to read small print. In any case, the opening tune on the album is called Guiding Lights, plural. And yeah, just to think about the title for a moment, as I always do, I will say guiding light is the kind of phrase that has a both literal/visual frame of reference, but also figurative and metaphorical, meaning a guiding light is that which allows you to see and thus to move around more safely, to be aware of the terrain, to be aware of any potential dangers, and to make decisions as to what you're doing with more knowledge and wisdom than you would have if that sense of yours was not receiving any data. And obviously all those ideas and phrases can be extrapolated into the figurative realm, whether it's a belief system, a teacher who taught you wisely, books that you've read, a mode of thinking that allows you to process and consider more logically and or with greater perception, and thus to traverse life and or individual situations, be they moral or interpersonal, both, with more clarity and precision. But of course, it's the kind of phrase that could also be ironically, because many belief systems or cultural institutions or social movements present themselves or posit themselves as guiding lights, but on a more critical examination might lead you into struggle or conflict or prejudice, or otherwise not illuminate your path, but instead be a false guiding light. So I feel like, given Propagandhi's lyrics, which can, maybe not always, but can be scathing and critical and take a sardonic or sarcastic phrasing when it comes to the issue or the problem or the process they're addressing, I figure it could go different ways. It could be more genuine in terms of the meaning of guiding lights, or more critical or ironic. So either way, as I said, we'll look at the lyrics proper after we listen. This is Propagandhi, the first tune on their At Peace album 2025 on Brett Gurowitz's Epitaph label, and it is Guiding Lights.
Laughter, joyous songs. The guests are dancing, but something's off. Distant pounding, cascades of light. Cheers erupt into the night. Cathartic for the soul. Euphoric on these nights of blood. How can you say that you're appalled? Final cleansing, ecstatic purge. Throw the children on the park. Cafes bustling, the streets alive. Embracing terror, spinning fire. Long before our time, our guiding lights are here. Violent, miserable, distant pounding, cascades of light. Cheers erupt into the night. Killing, cathartic for the soul.
Wow. Quite an opener. So yes, a heavier tune, a tune with a bit of a dissonant sound. I wondered who that was on lead vocals. It didn't sound obviously like Chris. I suppose it sounded a bit more like Todd, but Todd's vocals tend to be a bit more shouty, or at least on their previous albums that is typically the case. He tends to sing a bit more full-throated, so to speak. So yes, I wonder if that's Chris singing in a lower register, almost like a whisper, like breathy type of delivery, or whether that was Todd, but singing a bit more melodically or restrained compared to his, again, more shouty type vocals. Either way, I enjoyed the vocals, and I think there were a couple moments where there were perhaps both of them, and ultimately, I'm not sure, I didn't hear Sue Lin on that one. I know sometimes she does some of the shouty vocals. Again, I remember when I saw them at the Observatory in Santa Ana on their tour for Victory Lap. I remember in Back to the Motor League, Sue Lin gave a huge yell shout in that part where it breaks down and then goes back into the chorus again. So yes, I was waiting to see, again, just exactly, or waiting to hear exactly who was on that track vocally. Nevertheless, I enjoy the heavy sound. It has a bit of a metal sound, like a down-tempo metal track, which again, maybe pushes me toward thinking this might be a Todd-written song. In any case, what I took away from the lyrics before I look at the lyric sheet here, it sounded like there was a lot of catharsis being discussed, something that was an ecstatic purge, something that was a ceremonial or symbolic cleansing of whether it's bad feelings or troubles or dangers to a larger society and so on. But it felt like there was an inherent critique in that, because especially that line about, how can you act appalled, or how can you be so appalled? But there were lines about, throwing everything onto the pyre, or the fire, essentially, including the children. And so maybe there's an idea that it was some runaway war or national cause that eventually had people being aghast, but people with perhaps a sharper and more critical moral angle on whatever that was is saying, now you're appalled, now you act like you're appalled, everything before then you were fine with, but now suddenly you take moral objection, which it sounds like a judgment, a condemnation of previous indifference, or even going along with actions and processes that were themselves already quite immoral. So, as I said, I will check this out. And also, as I said, because I'm an older fellow, sometimes smaller print gives me troubles, so let me just make sure I can see everything here. Okay, so the lines are: sounds of laughter, joyous songs, the guests are dancing but something's off, distant pounding, cascades of light, cheers erupt into the night. Killing, catharsis for the soul, or cathartic for the soul, euphoric are these nights of blood, how can you say that you're appalled? Final cleansing, ecstatic purge, throw their children on the pyre, cafes bustling, the streets alive, embracing terror, the spinning fire, the choice of a lifetime, we wait, our guiding lights are here, vile and miserable. The time to draw the line was long before our time, our guiding lights are here, vile and miserable, distant pounding, cascades of light, cheers erupt into the night, killing, cathartic for the soul, euphoric are these nights of blood, how can you say you're appalled? So yeah, it feels like it is more or less what I was thinking, this idea that maybe being okay with wars and aerial bombing and humanitarian interventions is all well and good when you can sit at home and it's all very far away and your government is positing itself as a champion of democratic values and is only using force because they have to get out this unsavory character, and then they can show that they're the morally righteous entity in this conflict, and they'll help rebuild with a price tag, of course. But suddenly when the bombs are closer to home, suddenly when your kids are going off to fight in these wars or are being bombed in residential buildings, suddenly now you're appalled, now you find this upsetting. So again, I think there's some real world events of the last couple years and wars and conflicts that this could relate to, that wait, like, so you're upset about this war that's happening now, and to be fair, there's nothing wrong with that. You should be upset at civilians getting destroyed in bombs that are sent by people making decisions, and people being killed for reasons that have nothing to do with their choices and their lives. But if you care now, why didn't you care before? Why didn't you care when there were wars that maybe you were waving flags for and all excited because you felt like you were on the right side of history, despite the mounting civilian casualties by the thousands, the tens of thousands, the transparently, or at the very least quite dubious justifications, transparently dubious or at least questionable justifications for interventions, and intelligence that was clearly misused to justify sending troops and invading a foreign country, and again leading to the deaths of many civilians, as well as rank and file soldiers who again have little input on the way they're used or the way they're deployed. So if I'm reading that right, it's basically saying that suddenly when you can hear the bombs 20, 30 miles away, 5 miles away in your own city, and when it's your own children dying, or when you have some more personal connection or national connection to this death and slaughter and imperialism, now you're appalled? Well, it's good you're appalled now, but what about before? The place to draw a line, it was long before this generation. It was long before this conflict, long before this moment. So yeah, I feel like that's generally the essence of the lyrics as I take them. Of course, when I do reactions, and maybe even more particularly punk rock reactions, especially for a song I've never heard before, I'm thinking in the moment, and I welcome any alternative views or insights. So do let me know how you take the lyrics. Again, a less overtly punk sounding tune, and again, I was just talking to a couple different people about this, and punk rock, I think it's defined more by an ethos, an attitude, an approach, whether that's specifically a DIY approach, an independent label, but also a manner of thinking and speaking and viewing the world, not so much about, are the guitar riffs, do they sound a certain way, is it a certain BPM, a certain tempo, but going along with the idea that punk rock, especially, hardcore punk rock, tends to have a certain sound and speed. I would say this was a less punk sounding tune. I wouldn't be surprised if there are other tracks on the album with a bit more energy and pace, typical of Propagandhi that we've heard on the last few albums, which again is very different from How to Clean Everything. That's another thing I've talked about a lot. I know that Chris and others in the band, I think, have commented on the way that How to Clean Everything, it's an album they made in a certain time, and over time their sound has evolved, and they probably will never make another record that quite sounds like that again. But of course, it's still very special to me, and I think a lot of Propagandhi fans, so I love their evolution, but I also love their early sound. So I'm always just keen to hear when I get a new album from a band I've known for a long time, be it Propagandhi or Bad Religion, or even, Subhumans, the bands that I really got into in my earliest days of listening to punk rock. I'm always curious the degree to which they have an evolved sound, a newer sound, the degree to which they're doing similar things sonically as they've done before, but maybe with a new twist, or, with aging vocals and so on, which again is not a knock, but ultimately many bands, especially those that have been around a long time, you can hear the lead singer's voice. It's not the same when they're in their 40s or early 50s as it is when they were 18 or 21. So in any case, I'm very excited to go through the rest of the album. Once again, shout out to all the punks who've been watching my channel and Propagandhi reactions specifically for a while now. Shout out to Propagandhi themselves, to Brett and Epitaph, and to all those punks out in the world who don't want to hear explosions and see funeral pyres and moral travesties masquerading as, again, humanitarian interventions and so on. So let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Peace.